Next, I would like to talk about IDs. So if you recall, when we were making these section elements, we put IDs on them. And the reason we did that initially is for our kind of navigation list up here. If you click on one of these list items, it takes you directly to that ID. Now, IDs can also be targeted by CSS. And remember that IDs differ from classes in a pretty important way, in that IDs should be unique on the page. In other words, this section has an ID called ingredients, which means we shouldn't have any other HTML element on this page with that same ID. We could have, say, ingredients 1, ingredients 2, and so on, but your ID should only appear once in any given HTML document. And consider the difference between an ID and a class, right? So a class you use in terms of the CSS to maybe style multiple elements at once, whereas an ID you can use to style that particular element because it is unique. So what that would look like is instead of a dot, in CSS you use this hashtag or a pound sign. And then you just put the name of the ID. And it looks just like we did up in our list item, right? That's what we were doing here. We're giving the reference to go to this ID. Well, it's kind of the same story in CSS. So in CSS here, we're just directly accessing, directly grabbing this ID. And then we can apply any style we want to it, right? So we can change the text color to be color sky blue, for example. Might be hard to see against the blue background, but let's refresh, and there we see that our ingredients element has all been styled via the ID attribute, right? The ID selector in CSS. And IDs, just like classes, just like any other kind of general selector, you can kind of combine them. So you can say ingredients, and then grab the direct H4 descendant and do similar styling here. Right, so if you only wanted to color this, you'd say color sky blue, font family, italic, for example. Let's do a refresh. Right, okay. Looks like it didn't like the italic. Let's try cursive instead. We'll refresh. There we go. Right, so this element is now sky blue and cursive. And I'm just going to make some space here. You can do it this way. You can do it you can do it this way as well. That'll work. This would grab, of course, any descendant H4. And as well, you can do like we do here, div.green background. You could do section. Instead of a dot, you would use the pound sign, ingredients, and this would have the same effect. Right, so we can do color orange, and it would definitely work. Let's just do a sanity check. Yep, so there we go. And you can kind of go down the line, right? So if you wanted to grab every UL and every list item within that UL, you could do so like this and set the color of only those list items. Right, refresh. Now these are all colored. You could access the UL itself and give it some more padding. It does have some built-in padding already. That's why it's kind of offset from the left. But you could do something like padding left. Let's give it 100 pixel padding on the left. Right, you could definitely do that easily. And grabbing out IDs is pretty straightforward. It's just like grabbing out classes, with the exception instead of a dot, you use this number sign. Right, so definitely take some time to consider the difference between an ID and a class. Where should you use an ID versus where should you use a class? If it's something like these divs that all should be styled in a similar way, it makes sense to use a class on each of them. Whereas if it's a unique element that you need to style in a certain particular way, you probably want to have an ID on it, provided it's going to be unique. Now, can an element have both a class and an ID on it? Yeah, sure can. All right, so let's put a class here on this section. Class equals green background. Now this element has both an ID and a class, and you know what? That's totally fine. If I refresh here, well, we'll see if it takes hold here. Green background. Okay, and you know why it's not working is because here we have the div in front of green background. So if I get rid of that, that should fix it, because this is not a div, right? This is a section. So let's try that again. There we go. Now this has a class applied on it, as well as the ID stylings. And this stuff is totally unaffected, of course. We didn't tinker with that too much. Right, so they each have their use cases, and just take some time to consider what should be used where.